So our next panel discussion is how to reach a gentle death in New Mexico. And I think you're going to find this a very interesting panel, and I expect a lot of you are going to have questions and Q&A with our panel. This panel will be moderated by Jean Anderson, and I'll let her introduce herself when she comes up. And I want to just, again, give a shout out and thank you for the sponsors for the Before I Die New Mexico Festival that make all of this possible. That includes A Good Goodbye, funeral planning for those who don't plan to die. That's my company. EternityGardens.com, National Guardian Life Insurance Company, Estate Pros, French Funerals and Cremations, Morris Hall Estate Planning Law Firm, Legacy Concierge, Passages International, and Zia Trust. So let's get down to it with our next panel, How to Reach a Gentle Death in New Mexico.
Good afternoon, and thanks for joining us. My name is Jean Anderson, and I work with the Compassion and Choices Action Team. Is that better? Okay. And today's session is going to focus on looking at healthcare options as the end of life nears. So we are going to be talking about everything from kind of having a conversation about your healthcare options all the way through medical aid in dying. And since we have 3 different speakers and we have a lot of information to cover, we would appreciate it if you'd hold your questions until the end, and I will guarantee that we have at least 10 to 15 minutes at the end for questions. So I'm going to let the panelists introduce themselves as they talk about their section of the presentation.
Thank you, Jean. Okay, can you hear me? Okay. So I'm going to kick the 3-person panel off. My name is Revathi A-Davidson, and our panel is called How to Reach a Gentle Death in New Mexico. Next, please. My focus is going to be something called Having the Conversation. And it's subtitled, It's Always Too Early Until It's Too Late. And I think the previous panel gave us a nice setup because they were talking about how people do some of the planning, but not all of it. Some people do the financial planning, but perhaps don't pay as much attention to the plans that need to be made around the end of life. Next, please. So during our time together today, I'd like us to, I'm hoping that those of you in the audience will become familiar with a national initiative that was launched way back in 2012 called the National Conversation Project. Understand what it means for a healthcare system to be conversation ready, and finally recognize why it's important to have the conversation. Next, please. So Ellen Goodman, who was a journalist with the Boston Globe, many of you may recall the name, actually started the Conversation Project. And it followed upon the death of her mother when she was being asked to make decisions on behalf of her mother by her mother's attending physician. And she said, I actually didn't know what my mother would have wanted in terms of treatment decisions and options because they had never had the conversation. So she really set out to change the national focus and change the national norm, the cultural norm, surrounding end of life. And what she identified really with clergy and media and so on in the Boston area where she lived was something called the conversation gap. And there's plenty of data surrounding this. I've tried to give you some of the sources. But if you look at it, it says 90% of people think it's important to talk with their loved ones about their own wishes for their end-of-life care, and yet only 27% have done so. That's changed just slightly. It's gone up just modestly, but you can see the gap. Similarly, perhaps even more concerning, is that 80% of people say that if they're seriously ill, they would have liked to have spoken with their physicians about what their end-of-life wishes for treatment would be, and a mere 7% have done so. 82% of people say it's important to put their wishes in writing, and only 23% of people have done so. And again, going back to the previous panel, they were talking about some of these issues that need to not only be discussed, but needed to be committed to writing, to written documents, so people know what it is you want if you are either gone or if you're decisionally incapable of making decisions. 60% of people say that they want to make sure their family is not burdened, and that goes back to the previous session, with making tough decisions, but only 56%, but 56% of people have not communicated their end-of-life wishes. And the end-of-life wishes has to do with things like, what treatments do I want? Do I want everything out there, from the most experimental treatment to the most conservative? Do I want to be involved in my treatment decisions, etc.? Next, please. So the Conversation Project, as Ellen Goodman likes to say, is it's focused on not what's the matter with you, which is what takes us into most physician offices, into most clinical settings, but what matters to you. And what matters to you is driven by what your values are, how much autonomy you want, how much independence you want, and those kinds of things, those values drive your end-of-life wishes. So the conversation...
I'm just going to interrupt Revati, because I see people taking pictures, and we do have a copy of this for you, and Erin will distribute those at the end, so no need to take pictures.
Thank you, Libby. Thank you. And we also have a bibliography for you and some other materials at the end. So Ellen Goodman essentially launched a national engagement campaign, because the National Academy of Sciences has done studies 7 years apart, looking at whether, in fact, whether the needle is being moved in terms of people having an end-of-life conversation, and the results are pretty disappointing. So that's when Ellen Goodman really jumped in following the death of her mother and has launched this national engagement campaign dedicated to assuring that everyone's wishes at the end of life are both expressed and respected. And the expression comes from the individual committing their end-of-life wishes for the options in terms of treatment options and so on into writing, as well as communicating with people who matter to them, but also respected by the healthcare system. And what that means is that the healthcare system has a copy of their advance directives, that they're able to retrieve them at the time of admission to an inpatient facility or a nursing home or a hospice organization, which Libby will talk more about, and that, in fact, they honor what was written by that individual about what they wanted at the end of their lives. So it's two parts. It's the individual. It's up to each of us to take that responsibility and commit what we think we want. And again, like the lawyer said, it's not a dormant document that just lies there for 18 years. You constantly refresh it. The lawyer talked about 3 years. I think as our healthcare changes, we probably want to take a look at that document and refresh it, make sure it reflects our values at that moment in time. Next, please. So the question then becomes, and the National Academy of Medicine has this wonderful, what they call a life cycle model. And so the question really is, when should you have the conversation? And they talk about at key milestones. So when you get a driver's license, you're often asked about whether you want to be a donor, an organ donor. That's a very logical time. When you form a long-term relationship, when you start a family and have children, when you plan to retire, and certainly when you sign up for Medicare, since that means you're 65 years of age at least, okay? And obviously, those are significant milestones. Certain situations, such as high-risk jobs, so fighter pilots, window washers who wash windows on, the 67th floor of these buildings as they build higher and higher buildings, those are high-risk jobs, so think about that. When you engage in high-risk activities, when you start military training or you're deployed, and certainly if you have a major genetic or congenital health condition. So these are certain situations that should prompt us to think about, do I really have a document that expresses what I would want at the end of life if my family were confronted with it and I was not decisionally capable of making choices for myself. Next, please. It's time to have the conversation with your own physician. Physicians now, as of January 2016, are being reimbursed by Medicare to have these conversations. I would encourage you to talk to your physician or the clinical care team. Certainly during well care visits, preventive visits with your primary care provider, when you're diagnosed with a chronic or life-limiting illness, end-stage renal disease, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, congestive heart failure, these are some of the conditions. As your health worsens, or certainly when one enters the final year of life. So talk about your end-of-life values, your goals, and your preferences with your loved ones and your care providers regularly. The conversation may be difficult, but the question, as Ellen Goodman says, is have it at the kitchen table, not in the ICU, the most inappropriate of places to begin such a conversation. Next, please. So having the conversation, who? It starts with each one of us, every one of us, especially as adults. When and how? And so I have a link for you in terms of the when and the how. The conversation project that Ellen Goodman began has a marvelous website. It's on the piece of paper that we'll give you. And they have something called the Conversation Starter Kit, which is a very useful, practical tool available in umpteen languages at this point in time. It's been translated. Free. It's a PDF. You download it. You can revise it as many times as you want. But it is practical and down to earth in terms of the steps you should take. It's in 4 parts. Next, please. So finally, as I turn it over to Libby, I have a slide here that doesn't mean to make light of things, but the fact of the matter is that the world mortality rate has been holding steady forever, 100%, year upon year upon year. So as long as that's true, why would we not want to have the conversation, right? So thank you, and I'm going to turn it over to Libby.
Thank you, Revathi. I'm Libby Hopkins. I am a hospice and palliative nurse. I've been around practicing psychiatric nursing with a lot of emphasis on grief and loss for about 20 years, and then hospice and palliative nursing for about 15 years. And before I start my piece, I would just like to make another comment to dovetail with Revathi's. With that starter kit with the Conversation Project, not only is there a starter kit for doing your own advance directives, there is also, as you know, part of your advance directives is selecting somebody to be your spokesperson when you can no longer speak for yourself. Well, on that website, there is also a starter kit for how to be a proxy or a spokesperson. They all mean the same. What do you need to know from the person who's completing their advance directives in order to be sure that you're honoring their wishes as well as vice versa? So I always like to comment upon that. We can go next. Thank you, Erin, for clicking, staying after your own program. We're going to talk about the healthcare continuum. Can you go back a slide, actually? Or next slide, actually. Try the next one. Okay. No, you're good. So this is kind of a little overview of the continuum of illness. So we start by being diagnosed with a serious illness. What happens next for most of us is that we're going to have active treatment. Some examples of your serious illnesses could be dementia, neurologic disorders like ALS, Parkinson's disease, COPD, your chronic lung disease, congestive heart failure, other heart problems. Those are your serious illnesses. Cancer, of course. Most of us will begin by having active treatment. If we are elderly, if we have many other conditions in addition, we may not. But typically, if at my age, I'm otherwise healthy, and I'm unfortunate enough to have a diagnosis of cancer, typically, I'm going to start with that treatment. If I am diagnosed with heart disease, I'm going to take medicine. I might have stents and surgery. Following that, or at that time, we want to talk about palliative care. Palliative care I'm going to describe in more detail, but that does not require that we have a 6-month prognosis or we're terminally ill. Having a life-limiting illness does not mean we're going to die in 6 months, but it does mean there are many things in our lives that are going to change, physically, emotionally, spiritually, psychosocially, and we should be addressing those. Typically at the time of diagnosis, sometimes it takes a little bit longer to get going with that. When we have 6 months or less to live, if the disease runs its normal course, and we know that that's different for everybody, but that's the time to talk about hospice care. When we're on hospice care, we have decisions to make, and hopefully we've done our advance directives and our people are honoring it, but there are more choices to make at that time, and when we get through to that stage of the continuum, I'll pass it on to Keith to talk about medical aid in dying. So next slide, Erin. This is the continuum, and we talked a little bit about this. We see first the red area, therapies to prolong life. At that time, you will see a little bit of palliative care, more palliative care, until we're approaching the 6-month prognosis, which may or may not be accurate at the moment. And then following that is, you'll hear about the choices, and then bereavement care afterwards. So if you do the next slide, a lot of people want to know, well, you keep talking about this palliative care and hospice care, and I'm really not sure what the difference is. Sometimes people talk about them interchangeably. They're really are not exactly interchangeable. Palliative care is the very large umbrella under which hospice care falls. So palliative care is appropriate for anybody with a serious illness. And some people know palliative care as pain management or management of symptoms of chemotherapy and so on. But it is so much more than that. For example, when someone is diagnosed, let's say, with dementia, that in and of itself is not something that causes physical pain or requires treatments that have side effects. But what does it do? It tells a person that they are someday going to not recognize their loved ones, maybe not remember how to pray the rosary. People have lots of questions. Going to lose their independence. What do they want? Who's going to speak for them? And if anybody who has dementia of any type, if they live long enough, will lose their independence and will need someone to speak for them. And it's a blow to the family. It's physical, emotional, spiritual. Will I remember how to have sex? All kinds of questions that I can guarantee you that neuropsych person who's doing the testing is not going to talk about. And it's not appropriate to talk about at that moment. So as time goes on, there's that team, and it may be 10 years. That's okay. That's okay. What should we expect, and how do we have that support along the way? The problem is that it is not covered by the hospice benefit. So typically right now, how palliative care works is it's on a consultative basis, either in a hospital or in a doctor's office. As time goes on and we work on this issue, it will be a much more ongoing process where you're walked through the serious illness with your palliative care team and then move right to your hospice team. That's where your 6-month prognosis or less, again, physical, spiritual, emotional, psychosocial, and most hospice care takes place in the home. Next slide, Erin. Hospice care, mostly in the home. There are hospice units for intractable symptoms. Most everything can be managed where people want to be cared for. And next slide. So I'm going to turn it over to Keith now to talk about medical aid in dying, and then I'll come back and talk about some of the specifics of the medical piece related to that.
My name is Keith Julian. I got involved in the whole issue of medical aid in dying and end-of-life options around 6-7 years ago when several friends and family went through the prolonged and agonizing process of dying that was somewhat prolonged needlessly, and was concerned about my own death and death of my own family in the future and what could be done about this. So that was how I got involved. But this began long before that. As a result of people improved medical care and so forth, life expectancy increased more and more during the 20th century. Medical technology was able to prolong people almost indefinitely in many cases, so that the quantity of life was increased, but the quality of life was ignored in many cases. In response to this, there were several organizations that were formed, such as the Hemlock Society, that sought to find some way of providing some greater degree of autonomy to people in choosing how and when they die in a dignified way and not through prolonged suffering and so forth. And this was before the palliative care and the hospice movement really began. Unfortunately, during the 60s and the early 70s, a physician in Michigan, Dr. Jack Kevorkian, began to push this issue, put it at the forefront, got a lot of national publicity with his suicide machine and so forth. In response to that, a number of state legislatures and legislators throughout the country began to pass anti-suicide laws. So in 1967, New Mexico legislature actually outlawed assistance in helping someone hasten their own death and made it a felony, and particularly for a physician or anyone in the healthcare professions to do so. In 1996, the U.S. Supreme Court declared that medical aid in dying was not a part of a right that was guaranteed under the U.S. Constitution, which further complicated the issue. However, as a result of initiative process in Oregon in 1997, they were able to pass the first Death with Dignity Act that did allow people with a terminal disease meeting a certain set of criteria to control how and when they would die with the aid of medical professionals. Subsequently, 6 other states, Oregon, followed Oregon, Washington, Montana, Vermont, California, Colorado, Hawaii, and the District of Columbia have all passed some way of providing greater control over end-of-life options, mainly through medical aid in dying. And some of these were through the legislative process, then passing statutes. In other cases, there were constitutional amendments or initiatives. We don't have that latter option available here in New Mexico. So in 2013, a group of concerned individuals under the sponsorship of the National Compassion and Choices Organization filed a lawsuit against the state of New Mexico challenging the aid in dying, or the lack of aid in dying, and the prohibition of aid assisted suicide law in court, and they prevailed at the district level. And so for a brief period of time, within the 2nd Judicial District, which is Bernalillo County, it became legal actually for physicians to provide some means of assisting people to go out of life on their own terms. This was challenged by the state of California, went to the State Court of Appeals in 2015, and it was overturned by a 2-to-1 margin, which was then challenged by the plaintiffs again and went to the state Supreme Court. And in 2016, the state Supreme Court declared unanimously that there was not a constitutional right in New Mexico. So there was not a statute that was passed, but it was held, at least at the trial court level, that there would be a constitutional right in New Mexico. The Supreme Court said no, that this is a duty of the legislature to make this a statute and was not a judicial issue. So as a result of that, a group was formed called the New Mexico End-of-Life Coalition, Options Coalition, that decided in 2017 to introduce a bill into the long session in 2017 to allow medical aid in dying and greater end-of-life options. Next slide, please. The sponsors of that bill were Representative Debbie Armstrong from the North Valley, Senator Liz Stefanik from the East Mountains. It was strongly supported by the National Compassion and Choices Organization, by the New Mexico ACLU, and with the National Death with Dignity Organization, as well as a number of experts and patients who came to the legislature, testified in front of committees in support of this option, and provided some very compelling stories. The 2017 End-of-Life Options Act passed through 3 committee hearings, went to the floor of the Senate, and on a vote of 22 to 20, actually was defeated. So it was very close to passing, at least the Senate, in 2017. This reflects somewhat public opinion polls in New Mexico, which support by about a 63% margin some end-of-life option and medical aid in dying ability. But because it was defeated in the Senate, the House never even took it to the floor. And so the sponsors of the End-of-Life Options Act, the coalition, decided to wait until the 2019 session to do something about it. Plus, there would be a new governor because the current governor's term ends at that time. Next slide. A leadership team was formed through the coalition in 2017, which began drafting legislation during the summer of 2018. And as of yesterday, I understand, the final draft has been prepared. It has not been released publicly yet, and will probably not be introduced actually as a bill until the session begins in January of 2019. In the meantime, advocates are reaching out to stakeholders and communities. You probably read in the newspaper that the Albuquerque City Council passed unanimously support for end-of-life options and a Medical Aid in Dying Act. The Santa Fe City Council passed, I believe it was a vote of 8-3, also supporting this and endorsing it. And there's been a very strong support among medical community and health-based providers. A number of legislators have agreed to co-sponsor or to support this. And the endorsement from various civic and professional organizations has also been obtained since that time. Next slide, please. So the actual act that will contain the following provisions, as I say, the final wording is just being drafted right now, but it will include a number of provisions to ensure that there are no, that there will be safeguards against any kind of untoward behavior that takes place as a result of this. So in order to be eligible for end-of-life care, and for medical aid in dying, you must be diagnosed with a terminal illness, which is defined as incurable, irreversible, and likely to cause death within a foreseeable period of time. It has to be an adult, 18 or older. You must be mentally capable of making an informed decision and requesting it. You have to be under the care of a health care provider who is authorized to provide medication or to prescribe medication. And you have to have the ability to self-administer that medication. Next slide. Healthcare providers are defined as medical doctors, doctors of osteopathy, nurse practitioners, or physician assistants. And the reason for that is because New Mexico, because of our rural nature of much of the state, MDs are not present in all communities. And so we wanted to make sure that this option was available to people who live in outlier communities. The diagnosis must be confirmed by a second consulting provider And if there's any question about the mental capacity of the individual who is requesting this, they have to be praised by a psychiatrist or a psychologist who can make some judgment regarding their mental capacity. The individual, the patient, must also sign a statement requesting medical aid in dying. It has to be witnessed, and it very explicitly states what the conditions will be, and also that they be informed of other options that might be available beside medical aid in dying, such as extended palliative care that would be provided if necessary. Next slide. Other provisions grant immunity from any civil or criminal liability to the professional health care providers, so long as they're able to offer reasonable care and are acting in good faith and complying with the End of Life Options Act. No healthcare provider will be required to participate in this. You may opt out of it, just as individuals may opt out of it. There is no coercion. If, however, a healthcare provider, whether it's an individual or an organization such as a hospital or a hospice, decides to opt out, they do have to provide information about other options or others who would provide this care. Finally, the existing New Mexico assisted suicide statute would be amended to create a clear exception to anyone who is acting pursuant to the End of Life Options Act. Next slide. So if you're interested in following the progress of this through the legislature, through the session that's coming up beginning in January, you can go to an online site that will track the bill. We don't have a date yet, but if you simply put in the name New Mexico End of Life Options Act, then that information was provided. And similarly, if you'd like more information about the actual End of Life Options Coalition group and some of the other organizations that are working, you can go to the website that's listed here. These references will be provided in the handout that you'll be receiving in a few minutes. Now I'm going to turn it back over to Libby to talk about some specific of the bedside aspects of aid in dying.
Those are the websites that he was referring to. So now we can go forward.
And in fact, those websites, you will have a copy of the PowerPoint presentation with those websites on it, and you will get an entire list of end-of-life resources. It is on there. These are on there as well. Thank you, Keith. Next slide, Erin. This actually is Erin's family, her loved ones. And you can go ahead to the next slide. So I'm going to talk about some of the nitty-gritty. What do we use in medical aid in dying? And firstly, just to reiterate, and I know people are concerned about needing to participate in the medical community. And as Keith said, nobody can be compelled either as a healthcare provider or healthcare organization. So if this goes forward, there will be a list of organizations and pharmacies and providers that will participate in this. And how would providers and organizations be involved? Well, they will be taking the requests, they will know the patients, and they will be writing a prescription. Know that no IVs, there is no IV medication to be prescribed for people who use medical aid in dying. Why? Because generally people cannot self-administer IV medications, and it's very important that people be able to do it themselves. In some countries, including Canada, I just accidentally spent some time with a physician from Canada who said that their medical aid in dying always occurs in the hospital and that it's always via IV medication. We don't do that here. What we use is a barbiturate called Seconal, or secabarbital, and this medication requires many, many capsules, and they're broken into typically a warm fluid, sometimes with some flavoring. somebody else can help you, either a healthcare provider or a loved one or a counselor who may be a volunteer, to prepare that. However, they cannot actually administer that to you as the patient who has elected to do this. So there's a warm fluid that must be either ingested orally, or if the person has a feeding tube, the person who has elected this, the patient, must be able to at least into a funnel or another mechanism of getting the liquid medication into the feeding tube, him or herself. We cannot do this for another. Because it's a lot of medication in fluid, very often the doctor will prescribe an antiemetic or anti-nausea and vomiting medication, which is taken prior to ingesting the lethal medication. It's always taken on an empty stomach as well for that same reason. So that, you know, if you imagine if you lose the medication, your family's there, it's a lovely scenario. You take the medication, you throw it up, and you have to start the 2-week process again, or whatever the length of time is. It's different in every state, will be different in ours. So it's very important that people be able to keep that down. There are some alternatives. There's a little problem with the Seconal in that the drug company, Seconal is an old drug from, I mean, way back. I haven't used Seconal since I was a very young nurse. And it was about, I think, 10 cents a pill before it began to be used for this particular purpose. And it's up now, you guys, to what, $5,000 or $7,000 for the amount that you need for this purpose. And so that doesn't give everybody access. Like other areas of healthcare, people who have fewer resources have less access. So some other kind of medications are being tried and used, particularly in Washington, to try to lower the cost and increase access. But most commonly, it's the Seconal. So you can go ahead, Aaron. Oh, one I didn't mention from the previous slide, unused medications. People often ask me about unused medications. So I don't know if you mentioned, either of you, but that a large percentage of people who request the medication don't use the medication. Very often it's something that when people begin to suffer, and suffer can mean anything. It can be intractable pain, it can be agitation, it can be all kinds of symptoms subjectively that are suffering. They get the medication. Sometimes people choose not to use it. It ends up being more of a security and a comfort. And so people want to know what happens to all that Seconal, just the same as we do in hospice with the leftover morphine. We have laws in a way that healthcare professionals or loved ones can safely get rid of those medications, and it's no different with these. Okay, you can go into what I think is the last 95% of people do this at home with loved ones around them. It's typically peaceful. Unconsciousness occurs at a median of 5 minutes. And that's after the barbiturate, not after the medication for nausea. Sometimes there's also an anxiety medication administered. Death at a median of 25 minutes. In vomiting or emesis in 2%. Or less, and we're getting better and better at managing that, so I expect that we can get pretty darn close to zero very soon. And next slide. So those are kind of the gory details of how it happens, but it's typically family-oriented and well thought out and planned.
Great, so that was a very fast trip through some of the end-of-life options that are available to you. So we'd like to open it up to questions now to see what your questions might be. Yeah.
What kind of trouble do you get into with your life insurance if...
Yeah, good question. The legislation in almost in all states says that on the death certificate, the underlying cause of illness is listed on the death certificate. It is not listed as suicide. And so it does not, in all legislation, they try not to allow it to interfere with any of the legal problems about suicide, because it is not suicide. Other questions? Yes.
Have both of our gubernatorial candidates committed to signing the bill if it's passed in the legislature? Both of them? Pierce also?
No. That is...
Steve Pierce has said he is opposed to it. Michelle Lujan Grisham, we have actually spoken with her, and she said she will fully support it if it comes to the House and the Senate.
The question in the back.
Is this essentially an overdose? What's happening with all these, like 100 medications?
I'll let Libby answer that.
So that's kind of a terminology question. It is not an overdose because there is a set amount of medication prescribed for this purpose, and overdose connotes taking more medication than is prescribed and then is appropriate for a specific purpose. So yes, it is a lethal dose. Semantically speaking, it is not an overdose. We don't prescribe more than is necessary for the purpose.
Yes.
The legislation that's been being proposed in New Mexico for this purpose seems to exclude dementia because of this term of suffering and expected death within 6 months. Is there any cure for that or plans?
So this really relates to, is the person decisionally capable? It is very unfortunate that people with mental disorders or cognitive disorders like dementia or physical disorders like ALS, if no longer can they use any part of their body. It is unfortunate, but the reason that is not allowed in any state in the United States, and probably won't be, is because our belief in the United States is that we aren't going to have somebody else do that for the patient, because that patient can't make the decision at the time, and somebody else can't do it for someone. Does someone else want to comment more?
Yep. It's true that you have to be mentally competent in order to take advantage of these medical care in dying statutes. However, there is a nationally established precedent in medical care that you can refuse to accept food or liquids at any time. And if you, as part of your advanced care directive, clearly state that if you are mentally incapable of participating in medical aid in dying, and you are terminally ill and you reach a certain point, that you can ask your medical care proxy to ensure that your providers cut off your food and liquid supplies. It typically takes around 2 weeks to die, but it's normally if you are unconscious, it's not a terribly painful process, but it's not a quick and easy process.
So if you're unconscious, so what Keith is talking about is voluntarily stoppage of eating and drinking. With people with dementia, when they become unconscious, and with other diseases, when you become unconscious, if you have elected not to have a feeding tube, or your family makes that decision, when you're not conscious or you're no longer able to swallow, that's not just voluntary stoppage of eating and drinking. Voluntary stoppage of eating and drinking is when you know that you're doing that. When you're unconscious, it's just simply deferring or not having artificial nutrition and hydration. Both of these things are legal.
But again, it's essential that you write this into your advanced care directive or your medical orders for end of death, the most orders here in New Mexico. If you have that, you can do that with your attending or your primary care physician, but definitely have it as part of your final legal documents.
And know where don't put it in your safe deposit box,
Right.
okay?
Right.
You laugh, but I'll tell you that people do it all the time. Where is your advance directive? Well, it's at my house. It's in my safe deposit box. Who knows it's there? Well, my husband. Well, if your husband has died, your husband's in an accident with you, if you have it at a 24-hour, if you have it at a hospital is open 24 hours. You can be in another country, you can be anywhere. If you keep that on a card or on your cell phone, that it is at a specific hospital, and the phone number, anywhere you are for any reason, they can call that hospital. And you're going to say, well, what about HIPAA? They won't release it. Well, in the case where they do need your advance directives, they can do that without signing a release of information.
Another question
So
here.
I can just take my healthcare directive to Presbyterian Hospital and say, okay, y'all take possession of this?
You bet. Yep, they'll scan it in. It's in the computer, and if you change doctors or change providers and change hospitals, remember to change it there or to change your little card. And each time you change it, as Revathi mentioned, every year to relook at it. You just need to put a new
We
one
would
on.
strongly recommend that you have a conversation with your primary care physician and the team, and that you make sure that they have a copy of the current advance directive, that they know who your healthcare proxy is in case you are decisionally incapable, that you've had the conversation with the proxy to make sure that that proxy will in fact respect what you want, that you trust that proxy. It's a careful process, and again, the Conversation Project has a whole issue, as Libby mentioned, on how to choose a healthcare proxy and also how to be a healthcare proxy for someone else. And again, these aren't static documents, they are dynamic, and especially as the trajectory of our own health changes, we've got to look at them and refresh them and continue that conversation.
Another caveat in this regard is that if medical aid in dying is enacted here in New Mexico, as it has been in the other 7 states and District of Columbia, prior to your going to the hospital or engaging a hospice service, you need to talk to that healthcare organization to make sure that they will honor this. They are not required under any of the state laws, nor under the proposed New Mexico statute, to participate in this. So it's very, very important, and we've seen cases over and over again in California, Colorado, even Oregon, where people have involved themselves with a hospice organization or with a hospital that has refused this. So it's a due diligence issue that you need to consider in advance.
And also remember what Keith and Revathi alluded to, that just like other healthcare procedures, if an organization cannot provide what you wish, they have an obligation to refer you out. So if you think that this is not something that's for you, and you are with a hospice organization or a hospital or others, and you change your mind when suffering occurs and this organization does not provide it, remember that this doesn't mean you have to stay with them. They must give you referrals and help you find somebody who will prescribe the medication and do the appropriate
And forward all your medical records to the next institution.
Other questions?
Yes. So about forwarding your records, I just moved recently from Austin, Texas to Albuquerque, and I tried to just gather up my medical records just for that move, and that was much more of a nightmare than I thought it would be, because some places they say they can't do it electronically, they can only do it hard copy, and so, you know, it's this high of a stack of papers, and so I ran into that sort of problem. So as far as, you know, the transferring of medical records, what's the best way to actually do that?
Sooner the better, as you did, you know, before you're ill. Engage a social worker who can cut through that red tape. The HIPAA laws are very important, but they've been, I think, sometimes misconstrued, misinterpreted, and it makes it very difficult. Sometimes there's a charge, once again putting a barrier for people who have fewer resources. So a case manager, a social worker can definitely help you because they're engaged in that unfortunateness all the time.
I think too,
Oh, okay. In whatever healthcare organization you're in, if you're entering a hospice organization or leaving a hospice organization, as would be with medical aid. Otherwise,
I think what I would suggest is the institution that was treating you in Austin, you signed a release with them. You've come to Albuquerque, you've established a relationship with a primary care clinic, that you ask the clinic to also requisition the records. And you may have to pay for it. I just don't know what the policy at the Austin end would be. But sometimes it does take a lot, especially if the chart, and I've worked in healthcare all my life, and sometimes the charts are about that high. In fact, sometimes they would bring them in on a rolling cart because patients have had multiple admissions with chronic disease. So it is, and sometimes they might just send the latest update. But I think that's a conversation to have with the clinic that you're in with over here in terms of what makes the most sense for them to ask Austin to send so that they can treat you in a comprehensive, competent manner.
One recent development here in New Mexico that's promising is that these healthcare organizations have adopted something they call coordinated care, where your primary physician and any specialist organizations or others who you go to within that system will have a unified system, often electronically. So in the case of Presbyterian, the system that I'm in, they have something called My Chart, where you can go to, all of your records are contained there, and it's very easy to do that once you get into that system. But you have to do that yourself. You have to initiate.
But let me speak to this because I have just, after 30 years with Presbyterian, because of my health insurance with my employer, have had to change, and it has been a nightmare, and I'm somebody who's in the system, and I know the ins and outs. So, and I've also been to specialists outside Presbyterian even when I was in the system. And so one thing I've found helpful is every time that I have records transferred somewhere, I also keep a copy. I have discs of every back surgery, every of the reports I have, and so I hang on to them as well, and that has been somewhat helpful in the process, but I know it can be. And state to state, nationally, it's going to be a while before we're all together. In the state, we're good. VA is not going to connect with those, so we give you all these tips, and we know there are also times when they won't work, but try to hang on to as much as you can yourself to share.
Okay, we just have another couple minutes. There's a question here.
Yeah, I'd like to know, Keith, can you talk about what the legislative process is? So there's this group that has created the act or legislation, and what now? What happens in 2019?
The New Mexico End of Life Options Coalition has been the driving force, but one of the members of the coalition is Representative Debbie Armstrong, who is a former Secretary of Aging or Health Care, I believe.
Yeah.
Has a lot of experience in this, and so she's the driving force behind this. She will actually have to formally introduce this bill, and the bill will be given a number, and then it will be assigned to committees. There'll be committee hearings. Typically, it'll be in her case, it'll be in the House. It could also be introduced into the Senate. Each of the committees will then make a recommendation, either to pass the bill on to another committee, or to send it to the floor, or to defeat it, not to take no action, which essentially kills the bill. They can amend the bill at any point during the process. If they get a pass recommendation and it goes to the floor, then the entire body, the House and the Senate, will take a vote on it. It requires a approval by both chambers to move forward then to the governor. If there are differences in a House version and a Senate version, then there would have to be some reconciliation before it goes to the governor, and the governor can either pass it or veto it at that point. And it would take 6 months, except on an emergency basis, for it to be enacted. So the earliest, if we're passed, say, in March, it would be next September of 2019, before it could go into effect if it went through the full process.
And what is the public's ability to influence that decision?
Good question. During the process of hearings and so forth, the public is invited to participate. It's a very, very interesting exercise. If you haven't, we have the only purely citizen legislature in the country. And these are very hardworking, dedicated people. And you can go up to Santa Fe and offer testimony either in support or in opposition to the bill, depending on how you feel. There are very, very impassioned feelings on both sides of the issue. And if you don't have the time or the ability to travel up there in person, you can write to your legislator or to the committee chairs. You can also, if you go to the website that I had posted on the handouts you'll get, you can actually see live streaming of the testimony before the committees, and if it does go to the floor, you can see the floor speakers in opposition or support when it goes up for a vote.
And I'm sorry to interrupt, but we are out of time. So one of the things...
Just one last comment,
okay.
Jean. I think it's really interesting to attend those because what you see is the legislators with their stories about people whom they have known personally, and this issue resonates, as you can imagine, with every human being in that room, whether immediately or a distant connection, but they're very much into storytelling. So going back to what Keith said, we would really encourage you to be attentive to it. It'll be covered in the press, it'll be on television, but be attentive and weigh in whichever way you see fit, for the bill or against it. Thank you.
Okay, so the materials they talked about, the PowerPoint and the resource list, will be available as you walk out the side door. We'll have them available for you.